The arena was silent, except for the soft rattle of dust still settling over the fallen body of the chestnut horse. Dozens of men lined the rails, their denim shirts stiff with sweat, cowboy hats casting long shadows over faces etched by time. Mathieu Gagnon, in his early 50s, stood frozen in the center of the dirt ring, one arm raised as if to hold the world still. At his feet lay Martel, his prized quarter horse, motionless but for the faint, uneven rise of his ribs. The animal's eyes blinked slowly, heavy, confused, and dimming. The moment had happened so fast. One misstep out of the chute, one slip on the turn, and a sickening crack echoed across the arena. Mathieu had heard it clearly, felt it in his spine. Martel had dropped instantly, legs buckling, neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Now, the horse lay helpless in the dirt, while the scent of sweat and sawdust clung to the air like grief. A few feet away, Caleb Fortin, the arena vet, approached with a syringe in hand. "He's in shock, Mathieu," he said quietly, almost like a prayer. "We can end it clean. Quick." But Mathieu didn't respond. His hand hovered just above Martel's neck, as if afraid to touch him and confirm what he already feared. Martel wasn't just a competition horse. He was a partner, the last piece of a life Mathieu had poured everything into. From the stands, Sophie Lefebvre covered her mouth, eyes glassy. She knew what this horse meant to Mathieu. They all did. Murmurs spread among the crowd. "He's finished," someone whispered. "Put the poor thing down." Mathieu's jaw clenched. He could feel everyone watching, not out of cruelty, but pity. The worst kind of attention. The kind you get when people know you're losing something you can't get back. Then, just as Caleb moved closer with the needle, the gate creaked open again. A tall figure stepped into the arena, dust trailing behind her boots. Juliette Giroux, long estranged from rodeo life, had returned. Her eyes locked with Mathieu's, her face unreadable. "Wait," she called out, holding something small in her hand. A glass vial, clear liquid catching the light. "Let me try something first." Mathieu stared at her, stunned. Juliette had walked away from this world years ago, disappeared without a word. And now she stood there, with a calm defiance, offering hope when all hope had slipped away. Caleb hesitated, syringe in midair. And in that pause, with Martel's breathing growing weaker, the entire arena seemed to lean in. The silence between Mathieu and Juliette was heavier than the dust in the arena. Years of absence, betrayal, and words left unsaid hovered between them like smoke. Juliette stood firm, one hand gripping the small vial, the other resting lightly at her side. Her face was older than the last time Mathieu saw it, but her eyes hadn't changed, sharp, determined, and full of something he hadn't seen in a long time. Conviction. "This isn't a miracle," she said, voice steady. "But it might buy him time." Caleb Fortin looked at the vial with a skeptical frown. "That's not protocol. Whatever that is, it's not approved for this kind of trauma." Juliette's jaw tightened. "It's based on my grandfather's formula," she said, glancing at Martel's broken frame. "It was used for shock stabilization in war horses. I've seen it work when nothing else would." Caleb hesitated, clearly torn between experience and instinct. But Mathieu, he was staring at her, not the vial. He hadn't heard her voice in 12 years, and now it was cutting through everything. Martel let out a faint, strained breath. His legs twitched slightly. Time was slipping. Mathieu finally spoke, low and rough. "Do it." Caleb didn't argue, just stepped aside. Juliette knelt beside the horse, her movements precise but gentle. She found the vein with the ease of someone who'd done this before. As she injected the liquid, she whispered something inaudible into Martel's ear. The crowd had quieted again, watching closely, unsure whether they were witnessing desperation or something more. From the sidelines, Isabelle Coty stepped closer, arms folded across her chest. She was the local announcer and longtime friend of Matthew's late wife. She watched Juliette with a storm in her eyes. "You think walking in after all these years and saving his horse fixes everything?" she muttered to no one in particular. But her words hung in the air, cutting. Juliette heard them. She didn't answer. Matthew stood slowly, brushing dirt from his jeans. His hands were shaking, though he tried to hide it. His eyes weren't just on Martel, they kept drifting back to Juliette. Memories rushed back like a flood. The night she left, the letter she never sent, the fire that took everything except that horse. He wondered, for the first time in a long time, whether his anger had protected him, or just kept him alone. And then, a shift. A flick of an ear. A sharp intake of breath. Martel's chest began to rise more steadily. Caleb's eyes widened. "He's stabilizing." The crowd leaned forward, stunned. But it was Matthew who staggered back a step, his heart thudding louder than the noise around him. Because something impossible was happening, and it had come from the hands of the one person he thought he'd never see again. The small barn behind the arena was quiet, save for the soft sound of Martel breathing inside his stall. Matthew stood by the door, arms crossed, watching the horse like he expected him to vanish. A makeshift bandage wrapped around the injured leg, and though Martel could barely stand, there was life in his eyes again, something fierce, stubborn. The same fire he'd always had. But Matthew couldn't shake the weight in his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not the fall. Not the miracle. And especially not Juliette. She entered the barn without a word, her boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. The lantern light caught her hair, now streaked with gray. "He's a fighter," she said, nodding toward Martel. Matthew didn't turn to face her. "So are you," he muttered. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was thick with memory. She stepped closer, but not too close. "I didn't come back to make a scene, Math. I came because I heard what happened. That's all." He finally turned. "You heard? After 12 years, you heard?" His voice was low, bitter. "And you thought what? That you could walk in and fix what's broken?" She met his eyes without flinching. "No. I knew I couldn't fix it. But I couldn't ignore it either." The truth hung between them. The way she left. The phone calls unanswered. The letters he never read. And the fire that destroyed the only home they ever shared. For years, he blamed her for disappearing. Now she stood inches away, and all the blame felt too heavy to carry. Outside, a truck door slammed. Adrien Lavoie, the young handler who'd helped get Martel into the barn, appeared in the doorway. "Vet says he might walk again. With time," he said. "But he won't run. Not like before." He looked between them awkwardly. "Should I come back later?" "No," Matthew said quickly, breaking the moment. "We're done here." Juliette gave Adrien a small nod and turned to leave, her hand brushing the doorframe as she passed. That night, Matthew sat alone by Martel's stall. He didn't light a fire. He didn't eat. He just listened, to the creak of the barn, the rhythm of breathing, the distant wind outside. In his mind, Juliette's voice repeated the same words. I couldn't ignore it. Part of him wanted to believe her. Another part refused to let go of the anger. But something else, something unexpected, was waking inside him. Not hope, curiosity. And that was more dangerous than anything he'd felt in years. The sun was barely above the horizon when Clara Bedoin knocked on the side door of the barn. She held 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one for Matthew. She didn't say much, she never did, but her presence was familiar, grounding. Clara had been helping around the ranch for years, since before Juliette left. She knew the rhythms of the place, and she knew when something was off. "He sleep?" she asked softly, nodding toward Martel. Matthew nodded, taking the coffee without a word. Martel was resting better than he had in days, but it wasn't just the horse that kept Matthew awake last night. It was Juliette's voice and the storm of feelings it brought back. Clara leaned against the wooden post beside him, sipping quietly. After a moment, she spoke again. "I saw her, you know, in town, a few weeks ago." Matthew turned his head slowly. "Why didn't you tell me?" She shrugged. "Didn't think it was my place. Figured if she wanted you to know, she'd come herself." That made his stomach tighten. She had come. But not to him, not really. To the horse. To the scene. To the crisis. And still, she hadn't told him why. Why she left. Why she never came back. Why she looked at him last night like nothing had changed, like there weren't years of silence between them. He took a long sip of coffee, more for something to do than the taste. "Did she say anything to you?" Clara hesitated. She asked if the old trail behind the ridge was still open. The one that led to the lake. That trail hadn't been used in over a decade. Not since the fire. Not since the night everything fell apart. Matthew stared out at the fields, wind blowing faintly across the tall grass. "She shouldn't be here," he said finally. But his voice lacked conviction. Clara caught it. "You think that's true, or you just wish it was?" He didn't answer. Later that afternoon, while repairing a section of broken fence near the east pasture, Isabel Coty drove up in her dusty pickup. She got out slowly, sunglasses hiding her expression. "She's not just passing through, you know," she said, voice firm. "Juliette came back for a reason." "She hasn't told me anything," Matthew replied. "Then maybe it's time you asked." That evening, Matthew stood outside the old trail entrance. The trees had grown thicker, the path nearly invisible now. But he saw footprints. Fresh ones. Juliette had been there. She was retracing old steps, going back to where it all began. And suddenly, it wasn't anger he felt. It was something colder. Dread. The trail behind the ridge was overgrown, branches scraping against Matthew's shirt as he pushed through. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. Every step he took stirred something buried, memories he'd worked hard to silence. Years ago, he and Juliette had ridden this path nearly every Sunday. It led to the lake where they planned their future, where they talked about building a home. But it was also where everything started to unravel. As he reached the clearing by the lake, he saw her. Juliette, sitting on a fallen log, her back to him, hair pulled into a loose braid like she used to wear it. She didn't turn when she heard him. "You found the prince," she said softly. "I thought you would." Her voice was calm, almost nostalgic. Matthew stood behind her, hands on his hips, chest rising with shallow breaths. "Why are you really here, Juliette?" She turned slowly, eyes meeting his. "I came back because I couldn't carry it anymore," she said. The silence. The guilt. That word, guilt, hung in the air like smoke. "What are you talking about?" he asked, confused. Juliette stood, brushing bark from her jeans. "The fire. The night the house burned. I let you believe it was an accident. But it wasn't." Matthew blinked, stunned. "What do you mean?" She looked away, swallowing hard. "I was supposed to leave the next morning. I'd already packed. I was angry. I lit the fireplace too high, too fast. Then I left to clear my head, and when I came back, it was already too late." Her voice broke. "I told myself I didn't mean for it to happen. But the truth is, I was careless, and it cost us everything." Matthew's heart pounded. 4 years, he'd blamed fate, bad luck, even himself. But never her. Not like this. The anger rose fast, but behind it was something worse, betrayal. "You let me believe it was a wiring issue. You let me rebuild my life on a lie. She stepped closer. Because I was a coward. Because I thought if I left, you'd heal faster. But I never stopped thinking about you. Or about what we lost. He didn't speak. Couldn't. His hands clenched at his sides, eyes burning. The wind rustled the leaves, but all he could hear was the sound of her voice and the crackling memory of flames. In that moment, something between them broke open. Not just the past, but the ground they stood on. Because if the fire had a truth behind it, what else had been buried all these years? The walk back from the lake was slow, quiet. Mathieu didn't speak, and Juliette didn't try to fill the silence. The weight of her confession pressed down like a storm cloud, dark and endless. The trail felt longer this time, more twisted. When they reached the barn, the sky had already begun to shift into dusk. Martel stirred faintly in his stall, his breathing slow but steady. In the fading light, his eyes followed Mathieu, not with panic, but with quiet understanding. As if he, too, could feel that something had changed. Inside the house, Mathieu sat at the edge of the kitchen table, staring at a cold cup of coffee. The chair across from him remained empty. His mind ran wild with fractured images. The night of the fire, the days after, the way he'd told everyone it was faulty wiring. He'd believed it himself, wanted to believe it. But now, every charred memory had a different color. Juliette's silence had painted over the truth. And he wasn't sure if he hated her more for what she'd done, or for still loving the sound of her voice. Outside, Clara Bedoin arrived with bandages and feed, but when she saw Juliette sitting quietly on the porch, she paused. "You told him, didn't you?" she asked. Juliette nodded. Clara let out a long breath, then sat beside her. "He won't forgive you easily." "I know," Juliette said. "I didn't come for forgiveness." Clara looked at her carefully. "Then why did you come?" Juliette hesitated. "Because I still see something worth saving here." Meanwhile, back at the arena, Isabelle Coty and Caleb Fortin stood under the scoreboard, reviewing the vet reports. "It's a miracle that horse is alive," Caleb said. "But he's not the same. He'll never ride again." Isabelle folded the papers. "And neither will Mathieu. Not if he doesn't figure out who he is without that horse or that woman." Caleb looked out toward the hills. Maybe this is what he needed. Not a ride. A reckoning. That night, the storm finally broke. Thunder cracked over the fields as rain began to fall. Soft at first, then heavier. Mathieu stood in the barn, watching the rain through a small window. Martel nickered softly behind him. There was a comfort in the sound. A reminder that not everything burns beyond repair. Some things survive, even if they come back different. In the darkness, Mathieu closed his eyes. He saw the fire again, but this time, not as an ending. It was a beginning. A line in the dirt that separated who he was from who he still had a chance to become. The next morning broke with silver skies and the smell of wet earth. Mathieu hadn't slept. He sat by Martel's stall, his arms resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the old wooden boards in front of him. The rain had stopped, but inside, everything still felt soaked, drenched in memory and regret. He thought of how many things he had clung to over the years. The land, the horse, the story of the fire. He held on because letting go felt like losing himself. But now, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. Juliette approached quietly, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She hesitated at the barn door, then stepped inside. "He looks better today," she said, placing the mug on a nearby barrel. Mathieu didn't answer. She stayed standing, arms crossed in front of her. "You don't have to talk to me. But you should talk to someone." He glanced at her, eyes red from lack of sleep. "I've been talking to Martel," he said. "He listens better than most." Outside, Adrien Lavoie had begun repairing the back fence, pretending not to watch the barn. But he was listening. Everyone was. The return of Juliette had stirred something quiet but powerful in the small ranch community. Whispers traveled quickly, and no one knew exactly what had happened years ago, but they all felt the shift in the air. People were bracing for something, though no one could name it. Maybe it was closure. Maybe it was collapse. Later that day, Sophie Lefebvre arrived with paperwork from the Rodeo Association. She was calm, efficient, but her eyes scanned Mathieu with concern. "You've got 3 weeks to decide if you're pulling out permanently," she said. "Your name still carries weight around here. People notice when you disappear." Mathieu looked at the envelope she handed him but didn't open it. "Let them notice," he muttered. Sophie hesitated before adding, "Sometimes walking away isn't giving up. Sometimes it's healing." That evening, the ranch was quiet again. Juliette stood by the lake trail, watching the fading light. Clara joined her, arms wrapped in a shawl. "You're not staying, are you?" Clara asked. Juliette sighed. "I never meant to. I just needed to tell the truth. After that, I didn't know what would happen." Clara nodded slowly. "Well, something is happening, whether you meant it or not." Back inside the barn, Martel stirred, lifting his head with more strength than before. Mathieu watched him closely. Maybe the horse wouldn't ride again. Maybe the past couldn't be changed. But as the wind passed softly through the barn doors, for the first time in a long while, Mathieu didn't feel frozen. He felt uncertain. And somehow, that was better than being numb. The next day began with a sharp crack of wood, Mathieu driving a fence post into the ground behind the north pasture. Sweat clung to his neck, though the morning air was still cool. It wasn't about the fence. It was about motion, about doing something to drown the noise in his head. Every strike was a rhythm against the chaos. The fire. Juliette. Martel. The truth. Each thought came back like a tide, and no matter how hard he worked, it never receded. From a distance, Juliette watched him from the porch, her arms crossed tightly around her ribs. She'd planned to leave that morning. Her truck was packed. But something had stopped her. Or maybe someone. She'd told the truth. She'd expected anger. But not the silence that followed. Mathieu hadn't yelled, hadn't thrown her out. He'd simply closed. And that silence had cut deeper than any words ever could. Later that afternoon, Clara Bedoin found Juliette sitting by the barn, staring at Martel, who now stood more comfortably, shifting weight slowly between his front legs. "He's stronger," Clara said. "So are you." Juliette didn't smile. "He'll heal," she replied. "But he won't run again." Clara looked at her. "Is that what this is about? The horse? Or is that just the excuse you both needed to finally face the real wounds?" Inside the house, Mathieu sat alone at the kitchen table, holding a photo in his calloused hands. It was old, him, Juliette, and Martel as a young colt. They looked like a family, though they never called themselves that. His thumb brushed over Juliette's face. How many years had he wasted resenting someone who had also been broken? He didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but something else was stirring. Maybe not peace, but space for it. At dusk, Sophie Lefebvre returned with a request. The rodeo committee wants to honor Martel. Even if he can't ride again, they want to bring him into the arena for a tribute next week. Mathieu hesitated. "A tribute?" Sophie nodded. "People care, Math. They remember. Sometimes you have to give them a chance to show it." He said nothing, but the idea rooted itself. As the sun set behind the hills, Juliette approached the barn one last time, expecting distance. Instead, Mathieu was waiting. He looked at her, really looked. "If you're leaving," he said, voice quiet, "don't go without saying goodbye this time." Her eyes filled, but she nodded. "Only if you promise to say something back." For the first time in years, he smiled, just slightly. And that small crack in the wall they both built was enough to let something real pass through. The crowd at the arena was larger than usual, not because of a competition, but because of a story. Word had spread that Martel, the legendary quarter horse once presumed lost, would return for one final walk through the ring. No one knew the full story, only whispers of the injury, the near loss, the recovery. And they certainly didn't know about the fire, or the woman who'd returned with it. But they came anyway. Out of respect. Out of memory. Out of something deeper that tied them to the land, and to men like Mathieu Gagnon. Behind the gates, Juliette stood next to Clara Bedoin, watching as Mathieu adjusted Martel's halter with quiet focus. The horse stood tall, still favoring his leg, but steady. There was strength in his stillness, a kind of quiet pride. "You sure about this?" Clara asked. Mathieu gave a slow nod. "He deserves to be seen. Not as what he lost, but for what he still is." Juliette looked at him, eyes soft. "So do you." The gates creaked open. The announcer, Isabelle Coty, called Mathieu's name with a voice that carried emotion. No sponsors. No scores. Just the man and the horse, side by side. As they stepped into the ring, the crowd rose to its feet. Not a single cheer, just silence. The respectful kind. The kind that says we remember. Mathieu didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply walked, one hand on Martel's lead, the other resting on the horse's shoulder now and then, grounding them both. He looked up once and caught sight of Adrien Lavoie in the front row, tipping his hat. Nearby, Caleb Fortin stood with his arms crossed, nodding in quiet approval. These were the men who had helped carry Martel through the worst, and the ones who had seen Mathieu through his own kind of wreckage. This wasn't a performance. It was a goodbye to what could have been, and maybe the beginning of something else. As they neared the center of the arena, Martel stopped and lifted his head high. The wind caught his mane. For a second, he looked like the horse he used to be, strong, wild, undefeated. Mathieu placed his hand gently on Martel's neck. The arena remained silent. No applause. No fanfare. Just reverence. A moment not for winning, but for surviving. As they turned to exit, Juliette stepped into the arena, her eyes locked on Mathieu's. No words. Just a look, full of the things they'd lost, and the weight of what they might still rebuild. One step at a time. No more running. No more hiding. Just forward. Weeks had passed since the arena tribute, but the image of Mathieu and Martel walking in silence still echoed through the town. People stopped him in stores, shook his hand, shared stories they hadn't told in years. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a man clinging to what had been. He felt like someone returning to the present, step by step. The pain was still there, would always be, but it wasn't alone anymore. Martel now spent most days grazing under the old oak tree behind the barn. His limp remained, but his spirit had returned. He would never run again, but he had become something more than a champion. He had become a survivor. A symbol. And Mathieu? He'd started waking up before dawn again. Not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. He was remembering how to live and how to build without fear. Juliette stayed longer than planned. Her truck sat untouched by the gate, dust collecting on the windshield. She helped around the ranch, fixed what she could, and gave space when needed. Their conversations were still cautious, but real. One morning, over coffee on the porch, she finally asked, "What now?" Mathieu didn't answer right away. He just looked out toward the pasture. "We grow something new," he said. "Slow. Honest. Whatever it turns into." Elsewhere, Clara Bedoin planted a small wildflower bed beside the barn. "New beginnings need color," she said with a wink. Adrien Lavoie kept coming by, offering to help with fence repairs and lingering a little longer each time. Even Isabelle Coty, who'd kept her distance since the fire's revelation, brought over a photo she found in an old drawer, Mathieu and Juliette, muddy and laughing beside a young Martel. "You were happy once," she said. "You could be again." That evening, Mathieu found himself by the lake again, standing where Juliette once waited. The trees had filled in, the path barely visible. Yet he could still feel the younger versions of themselves in the air, idealistic, reckless, full of dreams. He didn't want to go back to that. He wanted something different now, earned. He turned as Juliette approached, her footsteps soft. No fire between them this time. Just light. As the sun set, they stood together in silence. Not trying to fix the past. Not pretending it hadn't burned them. But simply being there, side by side, older, changed, still healing. Because some stories don't end with a final ride or a grand gesture. Some stories end when two people decide that surviving was enough, and that starting over, with open hands and honest hearts, is its own kind of miracle.